this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Tonight I am turning the studio over again to Deb Bilodeau and the chair of the GOP. And just so you're wondering, on September 23rd, we will have Terry Anderson come on the show. Terry is the chair of the Democratic Party here in Vermont. Just to sort of balance things out, I've extended an invitation to the Progressive Party. Haven't heard from them yet, but we'll keep working on it. So I hope you enjoy this show. Deb will introduce her guests, and I'll turn the show over to Deb. Just take it away.
Thank you, Pat, for allowing us to use your studio again for this panel discussion that we are having today. Today we have a panel discussion with 3 panelists. Those people are Dave Kelley, Rick Keene, and Job Tate. And the topic of discussion tonight will be education in Vermont. And with that being said, I will ask a question. Each one of you will have 2 minutes or close to that to respond, and then any questions from each other after that. So, Are you ready? Yeah, first of all, I'd like to take a moment and have each of you introduce yourselves to the audience and just tell us a little bit about who you are. We'll start with Dave.
Okay, my name's Dave Kelley. I'm an attorney. For 25 years, I was the general counsel for the Vermont ski areas. So I represented most of our ski areas here in Montpelier. I've been the chair of our local school board, and I've spent years organizing high school exchange programs for Vermont students throughout Europe and Eastern Europe. I think that's probably enough.
Wonderful. Rick?
My name's Rick Keene, and I'm a 30-year resident of Vermont. I've spent 6 years as vice chair of the Kelley School Board, and then another year and a half until merger replaced us on the school board as well. And my background has been in engineering and robotics in the past, and then I've worked also in transportation engineering and planning for many years, working with municipalities. And then I have a business, a prototype design business as well in Portland, Maine.
My name's Job Tate, and I'm a former state representative. I worked down the street for a little bit more than one term, twice elected. Represented Bridgewater, Chittenden, Killington, and Mendon in the legislature. Currently, I'm a chief petty officer in the United States Navy Seabees, and I serve on the board of directors for the Ethan Allen Institute. And I am the very fortunate husband to Lisa and the loving father to Mendon and Everett.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tremendous amount of experience in the room here. So we'll get started with our questions. The first question we have is, what would you say is the most important consideration for legislators regarding education issues in Vermont? A couple of ideas would be funding, cost, scores, children. Job, we'll start with you.
For me, I think it starts with the kids. I think that when we're trying to think of what is the priority when it comes to education funding, I think it's an excellent question to ask, is where is our focus? And I think we need to stop thinking of our education funding as funding schools. What it is funding kids. And so I think as long as we keep the kids in the forefront, and there's some orbital stuff there too, we've got to keep the parents at the forefront. I think that's where I land on that. It's kids first, obviously, making sure they're educated, making sure they're equipped for what's ahead.
Great bumper sticker. Yeah. Kids first. Rick?
Kids are really important in this, and they are the primary focus. However, I think fundamentally, something that's been lost, I think, is that our communities are very important, and they're fundamental to the success of our kids. And the schools in Vermont are unique in their the deep connections that they have with the communities. And I think this is under challenge these days, and I think it could have a severely negative impact on the long-term success of our kids and certainly the quality of our schools.
If we're talking about priorities for our legislators, I think there are 2. First, there's an enormous financial mess that's going to catch up with us because we have a $1.5 billion deficit. It's our public teachers pension fund is underfunded by $1.5 billion. And the medical health benefit for public teachers is underfunded by $1 billion. And even if we are really disciplined for the next 20 or 30 years, that's going to be an enormous challenge to bring that under control again. The people that manage those funds have been talking about a 7.5% return. If we get 5%, we'll be lucky. So we're not even managing those funds the way we should. I also think there's a deficit in leadership, because we are at a point where we need to redesign education, where we need to be thinking, what is a 21st century education? What does it look like? And while we have some good leaders in the legislature, I don't think we have the imaginative, creative, visionary people we need to be creating that kind of a school system. We have great leaders in our school system in Vermont, but we don't have enough really imaginative, visionary leaders. So I think there's a deficit with money and leadership.
Okay. Any questions amongst yourselves? I have one perhaps for you, Rick. So were you suggesting that communities and the school systems are disengaging from each other?
They are, and it's got a lot of ramifications. With the consolidation of schools and the ultimate closure of many of the small schools, it has a couple of really bad impacts that you actually transcend education. There are a few major pathways where we grow our leadership for this state. Select boards and school boards are big ones in this state. And it is a direct path that engages people in the community in their governance. So this is kind of a high level. It's one of the reasons that Vermont has been so successful, I think, as a state, and that we actually turn out honest politicians generally. I'm originally from Maryland, and I can tell you the politicians are not honest there. That link does not exist. There's a break between the constituent base and the politician. And I think that, this reduces that pool of talent that we'll see filtering up into our legislature. And what is really disturbing is that the reason people get involved in community and participate in these boards is because their voice matters. They're heard. They've got kind of a regulatory presence. And that is getting shoved aside. The voice is just becoming a checkbox on public participation. Decision-making is being now isolated, often by people who are not elected officials, and certainly are not protecting the interests of the community itself.
I would agree with Rick 100%, because what Act 46 did was it disposed of his enormous amounts of volunteer talent and leadership at the grassroots level where it's most important. And I think importantly, our school boards have become especially important training grounds for women leadership. And if there are going to be more women in leadership positions, our school boards are important to bringing those leaders forward. And to just throw them out the window the way we did was a really tragic loss.
One thing I'd say off of that, Dave, or back to your original statement there about the deficit in leadership. I think you're absolutely correct. One thing, though, is on the other side of the coin. I think there's some excellent leadership for the teachers union and some of those other forces that we've been able to see them make incredible inroads, especially over the past 15 years or so. And to challenge that, this is one of the problems I have with Act 46, is you're forcing school boards to go up against this massive force in the NEA. They don't lack for leadership, but more and more we see with Act 46, we're seeing ourselves get gutted, and
Right.
we're bringing a knife to a gunfight more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to your point with regards to lack of, I think, did you use the word creativity, in terms of redeveloping our educational system? Do you think that is the case because there is so much pressure from the current the lobbyists, the NEA in Montpelier, on the legislators to keep the status quo and not think outside the box?
I think we have sort of a narrow-minded conventional wisdom about education across the board in our legislature. The notion that somehow more bricks and mortar, more centralization is going to be more efficient and provide greater equity. And I think that's just plain nonsense. We live in a time when technology has given us enormous advantages we didn't have before, and we're not taking advantage of those opportunities. Our small rural schools are vital to the future. We are not going to attract young couples. We want more young people with children coming to Vermont. We are not going to attract those people to Vermont if we take our small rural schools out of our small rural communities. They won't want to go there. We'll ghettoize those communities. And so I think the leadership in the legislature and their priorities and their vision is just misdirected. We need to be thinking in terms of more personalized education, more community engagement. We don't need to be thinking about longer bus rides and more bricks and mortars and bigger, more centralized schools.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay, well, let's move on. We might have touched on this a little bit already, so we might not need to spend a lot of time on this. Act 46 merged many communities in Vermont. Mine was one of them. I'm in Essex Junction. And we merged with the town of Essex and
Westfield.
Westford,
right.
yes. Westford lost school choice in that process, and they were willing to give that up to merge. What is your opinion of the successes or not successes of these mergers? And I think we just went through.
I'm glad to start if you want. I think that's yet to be seen, but I think what you will see, and speaking, having a business in Maine, and Maine did this in 2008, went through this consolidation. And last time I looked, roughly 42% of the schools that were forced to consolidate were either in the process of or had pulled out of consolidation. Because, what the suburban schools tend to do fine, or the Middleburys, or your larger school centers. But the small municipalities end up giving up schools, and then they give up the heart of a community. That schools play a unique role, especially in rural communities, which is most of Vermont. They are a gathering place for adults with and without kids. And in our town of Calais, we're the fourth poorest town in our group of 5. And yet we consistently have, if not the highest performing kids, probably the second highest, and very neck and neck for first position. And we had, on all my years in the school board back from 2000 to 2006 originally, and even recently, we had close to 100% engagement in that school by community members, by parents, and then other community members also who didn't have kids in the school. And it's that connection to that local entity and that kind of ownership that is the reason our population, our student population, has been stable since 2000, whereas the rest of the state has been dropping 1% a year. It's a destination. The kids are there to learn. They see the importance of this by the engagement of the community and the people. And that is key to the success of learning. And I think, within one thing that has been lost, and it actually touches back on the last question a little bit, one thing that has been lost in our education bureaucracy is it's become this isolated bureaucracy that just does not look at a community as a living, breathing block that education is part of. They think that is the thing in itself, and within their own dogma even, they come up with these processes that are kind of cookbook, and they are rather inflexible, and Act 46 is an example of this, where it's a one-size-fits-all model that's forced down on communities, whether they fit or not. And you look across the state at the dozens and dozens and dozens of alternative the plans that were put forward, and very few of them were even looked at or accepted. And these, countless hours were put on by, working on by community members to make systems, merge systems that might work better, and they were basically ignored and forced, basically the preferred model was forced down upon those communities. And I think that the net result of that is that you will kill engagement of if community members won't put effort in, if it's wasted effort, if their efforts are just for naught.
I think if you talk to an average Vermonter about Act 46, the general consensus is it's not doing enough. If it was doing anything at all, it was a miss. Property taxes are going up. We're still hemorrhaging kids out of the system. The consolidations, it's been a bumpy road. And I think that Vermonters were expecting more from Montpelier on this issue. Back in 2014, that was the clarion call, fix this. And instead, we came up with this uber complicated thing that you need a Sherpa to hike you through the bill. It's too complicated. The average Vermonter doesn't understand it. I sure didn't understand it when I voted no on it in the legislature, but I understood enough about it that it was bad. And you ask a general Vermonter, how is Act 46? What do you think? They'll say, that's bad. I mean, what's the point? And I think, I agree. But we had a consolidation down in Bridgewater, a town I represented. They ended up sending their kids over to Pomfret. And I think that what I saw, the biggest obstacle was it was an emotional one. Mm-hmm. That was hard. And I think it's important, though, I think some schools need to close. There's going to need to be some mergers. We have lost so many kids in the system. There's just not. We can't keep all these doors open. So I think we need to sometimes separate ourselves from the emotion of it, focus on what's important, and go from there. But just to answer your question, Deb, I think you ask the general Vermonter, they'll say, oof, no.
Well, I think, just to clarify on that, there's nothing wrong with consolidation. In fact, it is a good idea, and you're right, it needs to happen in certain places. The problem is, the mistake made is that it was driven from the top with no thought to the community. This needs, and we said this from the very beginning, we testified in House hearings and multiple people, not just myself. This needs to come from the communities. I said, provide the expertise and provide the resources they need to do this, but let the communities figure out what works for them. Provide the professional assistance to help guide them. And that was completely ignored. And this, I think probably the only way to begin to look at solutions toward this is to restructure. AOE is a very tops-down organization, and it needs to be restructured in a way. I would almost suggest, in fact, Scott Thompson and I proposed this in an alternative plan to Act 46 back when Act 46 was first being proposed. We wrote an alternative and submitted to Peter Shumlin, but it was, essentially using, regional planning commission model that exists now. The infrastructure is right there. You create a commission, one town, one vote. And each region of the 11 or 13 RPCs around the state would have a commission, and they would elect an executive committee. And basically, they would have oversight over they would show oversight over even secretarial decisions.
Dave, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, to some extent, I disagree with Joe and Rick. And it's why I think leadership is so important. If you look at the other states that have gone through a consolidation process, West Virginia, North Dakota, Arkansas, Nebraska, Maine, what's happened is the bigger communities with the most votes have closed the schools in the little communities, and they've put students on longer bus rides, bringing them to more centralized schools with more bricks and more mortar and more expense, quite frankly. The buses are expensive, the new schools are expensive. I think we don't have, if we were imaginative and creative and if we had vision, we don't need to be closing these small schools. Technology gives us possibilities that we're not taking advantage of. We should be thinking in ways of keeping our schools close to our families, close to our students, and we shouldn't be thinking about long bus rides. We should be thinking about how can parents be best engaged in our schools. And that's by keeping the parents involved. That's by keeping our community leaders involved. That's by keeping local businesses involved. But when we follow the pattern of other states, what will happen is attracting businesses to communities, or even entrepreneurs or people that are going to run businesses to communities without schools is going to be incredibly difficult. We are going to hollow out rural Vermont. We're going to do just what they did in West Virginia. And that's just plain, it makes no sense. We need more leadership, more vision, more imagination, and more creativity.
Okay, thank you, Dave. We're ready to move on? Any further discussion on that? Okay, all right, thank you, Dave. The next question, I think we've already answered it. What's the impact of mergers on small communities?
Yeah.
Basically, it destroys the fabric of the community.
It does. It reduces property
Right.
values. It reduces tax base. What you're seeing around the state of Vermont is buyer's remorse today. If you go over to Addison Central, where they're talking about closing Addison, Ferrisburg, and Ripton, those communities are beside themselves. They voted yes. Now they're saying, what did we do? You go to the Harwood region, where they're talking about closing Moortown and Fayston. And again, those communities are saying, what did we do? I know those little elementary schools. They're great schools. And it makes no sense. And we do have some really great leadership in the education community. I don't mean to suggest we don't, but we don't have enough. It's few and far between.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. Do you believe Vermont should have a statewide school choice? If so, why? And what are some of the barriers that you see to preventing choice in Vermont? That's a big question.
Where do you want to start?
And we'll start with you.
I think the answer is yes. Yes, period. I think we have a statewide property tax. And repeatedly in my law practice, I've had families and students come to me with really legitimate reasons for wanting to go to a school beyond their residency. I will say this, I think that Vermont's come a long way since I started practicing law. I think the technical centers were a big step forward. I think that we finally adopted a form of public school choice. It's inadequate as far as I'm concerned. I think Act 77 was the biggest step forward we've taken in the state of Vermont. I don't think it's good enough. I think we can do a lot better. I think fear is probably the biggest barrier of more school choice. I think a lot of people are afraid of it. But if you look at the 90 tuitioning towns in Vermont, almost every one of those towns is fierce in the defense of tuitioning. It's why property values in those towns have grown while property values in other towns have not. It attracts people to those towns, and I think it's proven successful, and I think it's a good example of how things can work.
Is the fear that you speak of, is the fear in the current academic arena that we have, or is the fear in the taxpayer?
I think it's both. I was the chair of the Hazen Union School Board, and we were surrounded by tuitioning towns where they had choice. Walden, Wolcott, those were tuitioning towns. Stannard was a tuitioning town. We worked hard to attract those students. But I think the notion of actually working to attract students scares. Public education in Vermont functions as a monopoly, as many monopolies. And people who depend on monopolies like monopolies. But in point of fact, if you look at instances in those towns where they do have choice, it encourages schools, even like Hazen, to be better, to go out and to become more attractive, to think about our music program and our art program and our science program. And I think choice is good for everybody. I was an attorney. I actually worked in Eastern Europe as an attorney for quite a few years. And I learned a lot of lessons there, especially about public monopolies. I watched all of Eastern Europe collapse because they like public monopolies so much.
Joe?
I think school choice is a priority. I think statewide school choice is the silver bullet to a lot of the problems we're facing. You ask about a hurdle or a barrier. I'll be frank with you, it's the teachers union. They have a stranglehold on that building down the street. And you look at the campaign donations, the way they operate, it's going to be incredibly difficult to convince a legislature to pass that kind of bill. But I think again, this gets back to the first question, what's our priority here? Our priority is to educate these kids, to give parents agency over the education of their kids. We see that it raises property values, improves outcomes, saves a ton of money. School choice, and especially in a state of our scale and our size, this is a place we could do it and do it right. And Dave's absolutely right. I represented, 2 of my towns had school choice for high school. From their cold, dead hands, would you take school choice? And we saw down in the Rutland area, the high schools, it is very competitive to try to get the kids from Mendon and Chittenden to go to those high schools. And they bend over backwards. And the towns, they send a bus. They'll do anything they can to get those kids. And it's a wonderful product. And we talk about economic development. We talk about wanting to attract people to Vermont. Statewide school choice, beautiful.
To me, this is a no-brainer, because if you stop and think about it, if you're going to close small schools, would you close them because the bigger town has more votes and wants the money, or would you close them based on quality?
Right.
And who's the most attractive? Where do people want to go? Who's doing the best job? To me, it's like here we are designing a monopoly system of consolidation that has proven that it's disastrous in states like West Virginia. And if we have to close schools, let's close them on the basis of efficiency and quality, not on the basis of money and votes.
Right. Survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Go straight to nature.
Well, you know what's interesting is there's fears on both sides here. The VEA, NEA has a stranglehold on your legislators, is what I'm hearing. So they're afraid of school choice because they're afraid that the schools will become competitive they'll compete with each other for clients, our children. And so they're afraid that schools are going to become vacant and empty through that competitive process. But if you look at Act 46, they are selectively closing schools. So they are closing schools, but on their terms through Act 46.
Right.
Does that make sense?
You know something? And I would have liked to have seen the NEA have a voice and play a role in that issue. They stayed neutral. I was surprised. I don't think there is anybody in the state of Vermont who has been a more zealous opponent of Act 46 than I have. And I was surprised that the NEA sat on the sidelines. I would have thought they would have been on my side. I want to say something in defense of the NEA, because I have seen what they've done for professional development. And I think if we're going to really maintain costs within our school system, we have to understand how teaching is changing and how the burdens put on the classroom are growing. And I think we need to look at the bureaucracy and the administration, and that's where we need to really cut some costs. But I think the NEA, in terms of professional development, is doing more than almost any organization.
And those teachers and educators and staff need to be paid what they deserve to be paid. But one of the things that I do hear is they're very top-heavy. The organization has far too many, and that's what's keeping our educational costs skyrocketing.
Well,
We have less students, more staff, and
It's very important in all of this. I actually love school choice as well, because it adds there are a couple of real benefits. There are many benefits, but the quality control piece is important, because it really does. I mean, Callis is a very small school, but we've had very high-performing students, and the boards for years and years took great effort to really hire the right staff and work with the staff to do that, and that makes it a destination for, for parents with kids. But also choice, from my experience, most schools are small, and you have a different flavor at each school. And in a way, in the small communities, it serves you well because kids have different needs, and they might meld much better into a nearby school than they do into this school. And we can't serve those kids as well in that community. We should have that ability, and the parents should have that ability to match that. And this is an avenue that it gives that flexibility to, or some semblance of that, to the smaller community schools. I think there's one thing we have to be careful of with school choice, and that is to be careful to make sure that we do it in a way that's truly accessible to everybody in the school, and not just wealthier parents or only one working income households or things like that. Because that can deal certain parts of the population out of it. But I'm sure that can be done pretty effectively.
Yeah, that leads to another question. Since you just touched on it, do you believe that school choice, as it is established today, or even if we went to school choice, is designed for the wealthy? Because it's
Just the opposite.
because
Just the opposite.
No,
Because
it's
the
not.
wealthy have choices today. If
Right.
your family is affluent and you want to be an exchange student, they write a check. The students that are left behind and the students that don't have choices are students whose families can't afford. The wealthy, they can buy a house in any community they want. Their school, they pick it. It's the students, quite frankly, it's the students that are stuck in, East Hardwick, whose folks have lost a job. They don't have choices. They don't have opportunities. And quite frankly, that's one of the great things about Act 77. For a student with talent and passion, committed to education, those students that don't come from affluent families at least have a chance to begin college now, to take courses outside of school, to be exposed to other possibilities. But we need to do more. It's not good enough.
some would say that in terms of school choices for the wealthy, I'll give you an example. Let's just use Hardwick. If you had full school choice in Hardwick, you as a lower income family might not be able to afford to transport your child. And the wealthier people can afford to do that. That's the argument, that it's more designed for wealthier people.
That really, I think, is cynical about the abilities and the imagination of people from less affluent backgrounds. If you look at Walden, if you look at Wolcott, these towns are not full of wealthy people. These towns are full of people, sometimes in some of the lowest economic situations in Vermont. But they find a way to get students to the schools they think are best for them, and they would be fierce to defend their tuitioning and their choice.
I agree with Dave on that as well. I mean, I think, and just watching from our experience of people moving into Kelley because they had elementary school age kids and without a lot of wealth, but they valued education, they'll find a way. And I think it's our job as a state and as communities to help make that as feasible as we can. We can't solve all these problems, and we can't, there's this great myth of equity everywhere and everything. It doesn't exist. We can't, but we could do our best to make it as equitable as possible. And I mean, that inequity also drives the creativity.
Well,
And this is a thing that, I think we get lost. We lose huge opportunities sometimes because we try to, this doesn't work in 100% of the cases.
What you just told us, Deb, reminds me of a joke I heard in Russia. There's 3 farmers. One is an American, one is a Frenchman, and the third is a Russian. And each of them has a neighbor with a cow, and each of them wants a cow. So the American works really, really hard, and he saves his money and he buys a cow. The Frenchman petitions the government, and more he wants more taxes, so the government will give him money so he can buy a cow. And that's what happens. And the Russian still wants everybody to be equal, so he insists that the government kill his neighbor's cow. What you're talking about is the same situation. If we say, oh my gosh, wealthy people already have choices, and we're going to give them more choices, and maybe less affluent people will be left behind, what we've said is, we're going to deny less affluent people the possibility to have these choices because we're somehow afraid that wealthy people might have more choices. That doesn't make any sense.
Joe?
I agree completely. I don't think you're going to, even if they are not able to get their kids to that school, some of them will. You're providing more choice, and just like Dave said, the wealthy have choice already. This is not for a wealthy only
Good.
scenario.
Very good. I think we all agree on that. Let me just go on here a little bit. If you could suggest a legislative bill for the 2020 session on helping kids in education, what would that bill look like?
Do you want me to start?
We'll start with Joe.
Okay.
I'll take an unusual stab at this, and my bill would be to get rid of the corporate income tax, because we're having a discussion about education funding. We're talking about bailing out the boat. We aren't talking about the leak, and our big leak is the economy. We have a demographic. The term gets overused, but we have a demographic crisis in the state, and it's not going away unless we address the economy. And the legislature, Vermont as a whole, it's the fourth quarter, and we're down by a couple of touchdowns. I don't know why we're running the ball. We need to drop back and throw it for the end zone. We need something bold. For me, I would put in a bill, get rid of the corporate income tax. We'd be the only state in the Northeast that doesn't have one. And it's, on average, it's only about $100 million a year. That's not chump change, but I think we could probably find the savings somewhere and say Vermont's open for business. But that's the problem. There's a reason these kids didn't vaporize. The families moved away. And until we do some triage and stop the bleeding, we're going to have this is going to be a rolling boil conversation to solve this. So my bill for the kids in education would be an economic one, which we don't do nearly enough of in the legislature.
No.
Good. Well, you just said that the families moved away.
Yeah.
Also, many of my friends and neighbors are homes with no children. Their children have grown up, but new people are not moving in.
Right.
That's one of the biggest problems. New people are not moving in. People are moving out that have money. Retired people are moving out that have money, but we don't have an influx of youth coming into the state, providing us with youth. So
It's a big problem.
It's a big problem.
It's the problem.
Yeah.
Rick, what would you
I
do?
completely agree. Well, I think there are two things. I think that the economy is the basis of need, and what supports and drives the schools. And we absolutely need that in this state. As a business owner myself in Maine, Maine's making a lot of effort to do this, for that reason, because they've had some of the same issues. We're falling behind in this, and we will never fix this education problem if we don't make it affordable and possible for families to come and be raised, live and be raised here. And then secondly, I go back to that argument, I think in the legislation, I would restructure the control within our education to the point where we start, instead of pushing communities out of decision making, we bring them right to the table.
Yeah.
And I mean in a meaningful way where their voice carries decisions. There is a lot of good judgment out there. And they're far better than so many of the PhDs I've seen who have just been indoctrinated into a system of education, but they have no idea about anything outside of those borders, like the social conditions of communities, and that's what communities bring to this. They understand the need better than anybody that I've seen at the top, and so they need to have a really powerful and significant seat at that table.
But before I tell you the bill I would want to introduce, I want to tell you a little story. When I was the chair of our school board, a young woman came to the school board and said, I've taken every art course we have, and I'm really good, and I have a passion, and I want to beg you to let me take half of a year's tuition and go to the Oxbow School of Art in Napa, California. And we had a hard, blistering debate, and we finally agreed to let that young woman take some of her tuition, a semester's tuition, because her family couldn't afford it. Her mom was working 2 jobs, a cash register at one restaurant, a waitress at another restaurant. That was the most important experience of that young woman's life. She's on the president's list at the Pratt Art Institute right now as a student. I want to see opportunity scholarships for juniors and seniors that show passion and talent in a particular subject so they can dream of anything, go anywhere, and really have something exciting to look for as they're shaping their education here in Vermont. And I think if we do that, we would set Vermont aside. We would tell the United States of America, in Vermont, any kid can have a dream. And those kids that are passionate about their education, who are dedicated to their education, can go anywhere, study anything, and we're going to help them even before they go to college.
I agree completely with Dave on this too, and that is a piece. Our education leadership they're trying to produce this white vanilla system that wouldn't motivate anybody. And I think the key, education is about inspiring learning, because knowledge takes a lifetime. To become a Renaissance person takes a lifetime of learning. You learn very little. I studied engineering and architecture and had enough credits to minor in anthropology and English in college. And, but this much of what I've amassed in my life came from that experience. I developed some tools there to learn, but it's that passion and aggressive edge to keep learning more and growing. That's what we need to feed. And Dave is talking about that. That's what
if we could send that message across America, I think we could reverse the drain of young people with children leaving Vermont. I think there would be reason to say, in Vermont, our children can have a dream.
They got to have a job, though, to move here.
They have to have a job.
Yeah, I agree completely, but without the economic piece,
Yeah.
the whole thing falls apart.
Well, you know
It's the
something,
base of this pyramid.
one of the things we have to do is be a lot more imaginative about technology. Because, quite frankly, I was in Boston this week, and I went down there and I said, why in the name of God would anybody live in this place? This makes no sense. I live in Greensboro. I have bears, foxes, raccoons at my back door. I can go cross-country skiing. I can go fishing in the Clyde River or the Lamoille River. I live in one of the most magnificent places on earth. And I think of the people who are dying in New York and living the most suffocated lives in Boston. If we use technology, if we bring the kind of technology we need for people to work with their imaginations and their intelligence, I would have to think many, many, many more people would rather live in Greensboro than Boston. And the one thing we can't do is let our schools go. We need to make our schools more attractive, more vital, more inspiring.
Do you think that is the mission of the remote workers program that the state of Vermont has introduced?
That's the most silly thing in the world. That's like,
ridiculous.
It's
Cheapens
just
our brand.
ludicrous. It's a joke. But I think what we need to do is get some really exciting ideas. If it means getting rid of the corporate tax, maybe we do it. Maybe we create opportunity zones where we say, you know what, we're not going to have any state income tax for the first 10 years you're here, as long as you're here. Plenty of states survive without an income tax. There's lots of things we can do, but one thing we need to do is make our schools exciting and inspiring. And that takes imagination and leadership.
I have a partner right now. We're developing a tech logistics company, and it will be multinational in scale when it's done. And I was talking to some member, the chair of House Commerce one day, and about even looking at bringing that to Vermont. And this is tech logistics, so you can really put it wherever you want to put it, as long as you've got the digital highways to manage the data, which we don't have here, critical point. But I said, that's one important absolute need. The second and more important is that, you know, I need to have these small connected school systems. I can bring the young tech logistics people out of Silicon Valley and places like that. They will respond to this after being in, I have many family in, you know, coming out of the top schools in the country. Their kids are in these competitive mills, and it's not healthy. And you see what it does to these kids, and it's what creates a lot of our Wall Street greed. And you know, and there's a huge golden value in what this state offers in ethic. And I could bring people and sell them that small connected community school. And I said directly, I said, I cannot sell a Walmart version of a suburban school out of Boston. I said that I won't be able to bring people here to with the skill sets that I need to do it.
I agree with you, Job, that the future of education in Vermont is closely linked to the economy. The top 6 jobs, available jobs in Vermont, I recently was reading, they are groundskeepers, housekeepers in hotels, sales, retail sales, food industry. Those are not necessarily jobs that people with good educations who want to raise a family in Vermont are flying to Vermont for.
That's why.
But we have a new emerging agricultural economy in Vermont, and it's just embryonic today. If you look at Jasper Hill Cheese, if you look at Hill Farmstead Brewery, if you look down the road at Bar Hill Distillers or Pete's Greens, there is a food industry that's value added, that's a new agricultural economy. The Center for an Agricultural Economy in Hardwick is a big piece of that. But there is opportunity here if people want to use their imaginations and seize it. But it takes leadership, and it takes enough to start bringing entrepreneurial people to Vermont.
Right, those are the entrepreneurs that you're referring to. When I think what this article was referring to was food industry being McDonald's, fast foods, restaurants, working in the kitchen, serving. Those are not high-paying jobs, as we know. So people from outside of Vermont are now saying, I'm going to go to Vermont and work at McDonald's.
In 10 years,
Or-
Jasper Hill Cheese has created over 100 jobs in the Northeast Kingdom.
But it takes that leadership.
It
Well,
takes
to
do
leadership,
that.
it takes entrepreneurial talent, but if we have the right schools, they become a magnet. There's nothing that's going to turn the Vermont dynamic around in a week or a month or a year. It's going to take a real vision.
There's a component here in my business. We were brought into a very famous tech incubator in Atlanta, which is the guy who developed Alexa is out of that and so on. And they have a 95% success rate in their businesses they incubate. And these are tech businesses. Much of the Georgia economy, and certainly Atlanta, is built around this incubator. And in my experience, I've had businesses most of my life. Vermont is loaded with entrepreneurial talent. To survive here, you've got to be pretty industrious, flexible, and hardy. And this is something that the government could work with businesses to create incubators. If our business is successful, we will bring it here ourselves. My partner and I will bring it to Maine and Vermont. But that is a whole education unto itself. Those incubators are not just providing office space. These are all taught. The people teaching in them and operating them are very successful entrepreneurs, and they come back and give business time back to that to train the next generations, and that's why they have such high success rates. We start incubating. That's the way you start incubating business. We've got the schools and the people to draw on here. You don't have to have huge numbers. They typically have a few hundred at one time that are being incubated. But what they generate and their affiliation with Georgia Tech, I mean, it's mind-boggling. And everybody from Google to Amazon, they all sponsor this. They partner with the state, but the state's actually a minor partner. It's actually supported by all the big businesses and people that came out of this program and ended up coming back like alumni to really teach the next generations.
You know, when you talk about leadership and all this, though, I think of it through the prism of Rutland County, and down there, something like the worker relocation, the quote unquote $10,000 bribe, just boggles their mind. It's so frustrating for them. They want action. They want the ability for imagination and an entrepreneurial spirit to have free reign. And there's just so much frustration, at least down in that neck of the woods. So.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I'd like to get to one more question before our time is up. There's several good questions here, but because we're talking about education, what do you believe the role of the State Board of Education is, and would you make any changes?
Yes,
Joe, we'll start with you.
Well, I would say I think it's too political right now. I wish that the state boards, the school boards, could set it up. They'd be the ones to come up with some sort of election process, as it is now. The governor appoints.
Bottom up.
Yeah, and so I think with how political it is, I think that helps see some of the mission creep that concerns a culture voter like myself, someone who's concerned with my young kids going into the school. I have a lot of concerns about some of the mission creep we see in schools, and so I'm concerned with just the political nature of the school board.
It's completely political, and I agree completely with Joe. I think I would go back to the model I talked about earlier and say, you know, if you had, that needs to be created and elected by the people of the town. They're not appointed.
Yeah.
They need to, I would use a regional planning commission type model, and those one-to-one, those one town, one representative commissions could decide and elect members or to a board like that. They need to be accountable to the people, definitely.
Dave?
Well, first of all, the notion that those folks coming to Montpelier know more about managing Hazen Union High School than our school board does is silly. Our school board, we have an entrepreneur who started a business with 40 employees. We have a lawyer. We have an architect. We have a woman who's been a professor at a major university. That's our school board. Very talented, intelligent people engaged with the community. The notion that, and they're all good people. I know the people on the state board. Some of them are really bright. I think John Carroll's a particularly bright guy, but he doesn't know as much about Hazen as we do. So I think they need to step back. The notion that they have the power to transfer $8 million of debt from East Montpelier to Calais, and they know what they're doing, is almost crazy.
Yeah.
To transfer $500,000 of debt from Hardwick to Stannard, I mean, what do these guys know about what they're doing? It's crazy that they have the power to dissolve municipal governments and to create municipal governments. What does any one of those people know about creating a municipal government? They need to step back. The power they were given was way too much. What the decisions that they've been making should have been made by the legislature or by local school boards.
Yes, what Dave said.
I agree completely.
completely
Yeah, I
with Dave.
would.
Keep it local.
Yes.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
no question.
What kind of government works better, top down or grassroots?
I think we
Bottom
know.
up or top down?
I think we know.
When we
There's-
make,
the
when we make
answer
a
is
mistake at
it's-
the,
It's a no-brainer.
well, when we make a mistake at the grassroots, we learn from it. We don't seem to do that from the top down. They walk away from it and leave the price tag on us.
What I find interesting is that with all the brain power that we have in the state of Vermont, and three of you are sitting right here, how do we as such a small state allow this to happen?
Inertia.
How did we allow Vermont to get to where it is?
Well, I think there's a lot of explanations. Not enough people run for public office. You know, we all pat ourselves on the back, but we really don't. It means we're not doing enough. And quite frankly, I think as a country, our notion of sacrifice for community has dwindled. And you know what? To some extent, I always think back to John Kennedy saying, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I feel like we have leadership that's really turned that around upside down on its head. Because basically, more and more we have people that are asking what their country and their community can do for them. I think you know, we talk about giving everything away and everything free. You know, we've got a lot of leadership that panders instead of leads.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Our time has come to an end here. I want to thank all three of you for being part of the panel here.
Thank you,
This was
Deb.
Thank you,
really
Deb.
good.
Thank you.
Really
Enjoy
good
it.
conversations, and thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Deb, thank you and your guests so much for an incredible show. This was one of the best discussions we have had on this program. I thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed the show. I certainly did. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.